October 25th, 1944, dawned out off the coast of Samar in the Philippines. 18 American ships sailed in a loose formation. They were not battleships. They were not fleet carriers. They were escort carriers, small, slow, built to transport planes, not fight wars. Around them, 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts provided protection. On the bridge of the destroyer USS Johnston stood Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee Native American from Oklahoma, who had told his crew on the day he took command, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now." At 6:45 that morning, lookouts spotted shapes on the northern horizon. Within minutes, the identification came through for Japanese battleships, 6 heavy cruisers to light cruisers, 11 destroyers. The Johnston displaced 2,100 tons. The lead Japanese battleship, the Yamato, displaced 72,000 tons. Her main guns fired shells that weighed more than a small car, each one. The American ships had stumbled into the center of the Japanese Navy's desperate gamble to destroy the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Between those massive warships and the vulnerable carriers stood Commander Evans and his crew. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in naval history. The men of the Johnston, along with their sister ships, would charge directly at an enemy fleet that outweighed them 20-1. They would fight until their guns ran dry. They would sacrifice everything to buy time for ships that couldn't defend themselves. And when the Johnston finally slipped beneath the waves, even the Japanese commanders would render honors. This is the story of ordinary men who chose courage when retreat was reasonable, of a ship that refused to run, of a battle that should never have been fought, and the sailors who fought it anyway. Ernest Edwin Evans was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, in 1908, to a Cherokee mother and a white father. In a time when Native Americans faced discrimination and limited opportunities, Evans's mother instilled in him something unshakable: pride in his heritage, pride in his abilities, and a determination to prove himself in a world that often didn't see him as equal. His teachers in Pawnee remembered a boy who was quiet but fierce, who didn't start fights but wouldn't back down from them, who approached every task with an intensity that made others uncomfortable. When other boys talked about what they wanted to be, Ernest Evans talked about what he would do. In 1926, at 18 years old, he received an appointment to the United States Naval Academy. His family scraped together enough money for the train ticket east. His mother packed his bag and told him something he never forgot: "Make them remember you." At Annapolis, Evans faced the casual racism of the era. Some classmates called him chief. He corrected them once. If they did it again, fists flew. According to his roommate's later account, Evans broken his hand twice, and for years, both times on the jaws of men who thought his heritage made him less. But he graduated 1931 in the middle of the Great Depression, commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy. For the next decade, Evans served on destroyers. He loved them: the speed, the maneuverability, the sense that you were riding something alive. Larger ships felt like floating buildings. Destroyers felt like thoroughbred horses, dangerous, responsive, built for one purpose: to close with the enemy. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Lieutenant Commander Evans was serving aboard the destroyer Alden. He watched the intelligence reports flow, and during the following weeks, the Japanese Navy, the Imperial Fleet, was the finest in the Pacific. Modern ships, excellent training, combat experience from China, night fighting tactics that no other navy had mastered. While some American officers reeled from the shock of defeat, Evans studied. He read everything he could find about Japanese tactics, destroyer doctrine, torpedo geometry, gunnery solutions. His executive officer later recalled, "Ernie didn't get mad about Pearl Harbor. He got focused." In 1942, Evans received the orders that would define his life. He was given command of a brand new Fletcher-class destroyer under construction in Seattle, the USS Johnston, hull number DD-550-7. She was launched on March 25, 1943, 2,100 tons, 376 feet long, 39 feet wide. She could make 37 knots fast enough to run down most ships afloat. She carried 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and depth charges for hunting submarines. On October 27, 1943, Commander Ernest Evans read his orders to the assembled crew. According to multiple witnesses, he didn't stop at the formal language. He looked at the 273 men before him, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college kids from California, and he told them the truth. This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now. No one left. For the next year, Evans drilled his crew relentlessly. Gunnery practice until the loaders can service the guns in their sleep. Damage control drills at all hours. Torpedo solutions calculated and recalculated. He pushed them harder than the other destroyer captains pushed their crews. Some grumbled, but most understood. Commander Evans wasn't preparing them for peacetime cruises. He was preparing them to survive. The crew came from everywhere. Robert Hagen, the gunnery officer, was a Lutheran minister's son from Minnesota who'd been studying to be a teacher. When the war started, Robert Halimbaugh was a machinist mate from Pennsylvania coal country who could fix anything. With moving parts, Ellsworth Welch, a fire controlman from Texas, had never seen the ocean before boot camp in their letters home. The men wrote about the old man, naval slang for the captain, though Evans was only 36. They respected him, some feared him a little, but they all believed that if any destroyer in the Pacific was going to come home from this war, it would be the Johnston. They had no idea that Evans wasn't preparing them to come home. He was preparing them to matter. In October 1944, the Johnston joined Task Unit 70-7-Point-for-Point-3- better known by its call sign, Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, for destroyer escorts. Their job was to provide air support for the invasion of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, to stay out of harm's way, to launch planes and recover them. It was supposed to be a safe assignment. To understand what happened off Samar, you have to understand the Japanese plan. In October 1944, Japan was losing the war. American submarines had strangled their merchant fleet. American factories were building ships faster than Japan could sink them. The Philippines, once a Japanese conquest, were about to be liberated. If the Americans retook the Philippines, Japan would be cut off from its oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. The war would be over. So the Japanese High Command devised a desperate plan, a brilliant plan, a plan so audacious that if it worked, it might change everything. They would send 3 naval forces to attack the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. The Southern Force and the Center Force would push through from the west. But the key was the Northern Force, Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, now nearly empty of planes. The Northern Force was bait. Admiral William Bull Halsey commanded the American Third Fleet, the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. Fast battleships, fleet carriers, dozens of cruisers and destroyers. If the Japanese carriers appeared, Halsey would go after them. Every instinct, every bit of naval doctrine said, sink the carriers first. And while Halsey chased the decoy to the north, the Japanese Center Force for battleships, 6 heavy cruisers to light cruisers, 11 destroyers would slip through San Bernardino Strait and fall on the undefended escort carriers supporting the invasion. Those escort carriers were Taffy 3. Escort carriers weren't built for battle. They were built in shipyards that couldn't handle fleet carrier construction, welded, not riveted, thin armor, slow 18 knots maximum. Their job was to transport planes to forward areas, provide air support for ground troops, hunt submarines. According to one naval historian, escort carriers were called Kaiser coffins by their crews after the shipbuilder Henry Kaiser. Another nickname, combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. The 6 carriers of Taffy 3 held about 500 men each. The destroyers and destroyer escorts another 300 each. In total, roughly 4,500 American sailors and aviators. Most were in their early 20s. Many had never seen combat. On the evening of October 24th, the Johnston and the rest of Taffy 3 steamed peacefully off Samar's coast. The day had been routine. Launch planes, recover planes. The crew ate dinner, meatloaf, and potatoes. According to the ship's log, some men wrote letters. Others played cards in the crew compartments. Commander Evans remained on the bridge longer than usual that evening. His officer of the deck later recalled that Evans seemed restless. He kept checking the radar repeater, studying the horizon to the north. Something bothering you, Captain? The officer asked. Evans shook his head. Just a feeling. At midnight, Evans finally went to his sea cabin, a small room just behind the bridge where the captain could rest but respond immediately to any emergency. He didn't undress. He lay down in his uniform, shoes on. 2 miles away, in the darkness, Beyond the radar's range, the Japanese center force was emerging from San Bernardino Strait. The trap was closing at 6:30 in the morning on October 25th. Reveille sounded aboard the Johnston. Men stumbled from their bunks, headed for breakfast, began the daily routine. The carrier started launching the first combat air patrol. It was a beautiful morning. Clear skies, calm seas, temperature in the low 80s. At 6:45, lookout on the escort carrier Fanshawe base spotted anti-aircraft fire on the northern horizon. Strange. There weren't supposed to be any American ships up there. Then the radar operator saw them. Multiple contacts, large, moving fast. At 6:47, the identification came through. For battleships, the radio crackled across Taffy 3, enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of your task group and closing at 30 knots. The escort carriers couldn't fight battleships. Their 5-inch guns couldn't penetrate battleship armor. They couldn't outrun them 18 knots against 30. The nearest American heavy ships housed his 3rd Fleet was 300 miles north, chasing the decoy carriers. Taffy 3 was alone, aboard the Johnston. Commander Evans had been drinking coffee when the report came through. He set down the cup carefully, looked at his executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen. According to Hagen's later testimony, Evans's face showed no surprise, no fear, just a kind of calm certainty. Well, Evans said, "I guess this is what we've been training for." He reached for the ship's intercom and pressed the button. That connected him to every compartment aboard the Johnston. "All hands, this is the captain. Japanese battleships and cruisers have been sighted to the northwest. They're heading for our carriers. We're going to attack. Man your battle stations. This is not a drill." Throughout the ship, 273 men ran to their positions. Gunners to their mounts, torpedomen to the tubes. Engineers checked the boilers. Damage control parties laid out their equipment. Some were terrified, some were numb, but they did their jobs. On the bridge, Evans gave the orders that would define the next 3 hours. All ahead flank, left full rudder, prepare to make smoke, arm all torpedoes. The Johnston heeled over as she turned, accelerating to 35 knots, her engine straining. She was turning toward the enemy. At 6:50, the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, opened fire at a range of 20 miles. Her 18-inch guns could fire a shell 25 miles. Each shell weighed 3,200 pounds. When they hit, they didn't just penetrate armor. They erased whatever they struck. The first salvo straddled the Johnston. Columns of water as tall as buildings erupted around her. She charged through them. Commander Evans stood on the open bridge wing, wind tearing at his uniform, watching the enemy grow closer. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. The Japanese ships could destroy Taffy 3 in less than an hour. The carriers would burn. 4,500 men would die unless someone bought them time. At 6:54, with Japanese shells falling around her and the enemy fleet now visible on the horizon, massive gray shapes bristling with guns, Commander Ernest Evans made his decision. He didn't call for orders. He didn't wait for someone to tell him what to do. He ordered the Johnston to attack. At 7:01 in the morning, the destroyer USS Johnston crossed the line between courage and something else, something without a name. She was 3 miles from the Japanese fleet now, close enough to see the details of the enemy's ships, the massive pagoda-style bridges of the battleships, the long barrels of their main guns swinging toward her, cruisers flanking them, their own guns tracking. "Commence firing," Evans ordered. The Johnston's 5-inch guns opened up. They couldn't penetrate battleship armor, but they could damage superstructure, kill exposed crewmen, disrupt fire control, and they could make the Japanese pay attention. Every shell fired at the Johnston was a shell not fired at the carriers. Evans picked his target, the heavy cruiser Kumano, leading the Japanese column. 10,000 tons, 8-inch guns. At 7:05, the Johnston entered torpedo range. Fired torpedoes, Evans ordered, all tubes. 10 torpedoes leaped from the Johnston's tubes. Mark 15 torpedoes, the best the Navy had. They ran hot and true through the clear water, their wakes visible as they raced toward the enemy at 46 knots. On the bridge, the men counted seconds. Torpedo run time was calculated. At the right moment, they should see the Kumano staggered. As 3 torpedoes hit her bow, a 4th hit amidships. Smoke and flame engulfed her forward section. She slewed out of formation, her bow blown open. Flooding, the cheer went up on the Johnston's bridge. It died quickly. there were still 3 other cruisers, and for battleships, the Japanese fire intensified. Shells from multiple ships now. The water around the Johnston turned white with near misses. The ship twisted and turned. Evans calling helm orders continuously, dodging by instinct and luck. At 7:10, their luck ran out. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo hit the Johnston almost simultaneously. One hit the bridge, one hit the engine room, one hit amidships. The ship shuddered as if she'd hit a wall. The forward stack was blown away. The fire control system went dead. The bridge became a nightmare of twisted metal and fire. Commander Evans had been standing on the bridge wing. The blast threw him back, shrapnel tearing into his body. The fingers of his left hand were blown off. His shirt was shredded, his torso torn. His executive officer, Lieutenant Hagen, later testified, the captain was covered in blood. I thought he was dead. Then he stood up. Evans wiped blood from his eyes, looked around at the damaged bridge, saw his navigator dead, saw his helmsman wounded, saw the fire, shift steering control. To aft, he ordered, his voice steady, damage control to the bridge, give me a casualty report. He refused medical attention. With one engine room flooded and her top speed reduced to 17 knots, the Johnston should have withdrawn, should have retreated behind a smoke screen to make repairs. Instead, Evans ordered the ship back into the fight. By 7:30, the Japanese cruisers had closed to within 10 miles of the escort carriers. Shells were hitting. The carrier Gambier Bay was on fire. Another carrier, the Cullinan Bay, reported flooding. The carriers were dying. The Johnston wasn't alone anymore. The other destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 had followed her in. The Hull, the Herman, the Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort, half the Johnston size. 7 small ships attacking a fleet. For the next 2 hours, the Johnston fought in a chaos of smoke and shell fire. Her 5-inch guns kept firing at cruisers, at destroyers, at anything that came close to the carriers. She zigzagged through the Japanese fleet, sometimes so close that enemy ships had to adjust their fire to avoid hitting each other. According to Japanese records, at one point the Johnston passed within 5,000 yards of the battleship Yamato. The range was so close that Yamato's main guns couldn't depress low enough to hit her. The Johnston raked the battleship's superstructure with her 5-inch guns as she passed. It was like a terrier attacking a bear, but the ship was dying. More hits, more fires, power failing. The forward guns went silent. Their crews killed or their ammunition expended. The torpedo tubes were empty. Water poured in through a dozen holes. Commander Evans remained on the bridge, now steering the ship from the auxiliary control station in the stern. He was still bleeding, still standing, still giving orders. At 9:20, the Johnston's last operating gun mount fired its final rounds. She was out of ammunition. The Japanese cruisers closed in, at least 4 of them, circling the crippled destroyer. They poured fire into her. She couldn't maneuver anymore, couldn't shoot back, but she wouldn't strike her colors. Below decks, the engineering crews worked waist deep in water, trying to keep power going. Damage control parties fought fires with bucket brigades because the pumps had failed. Wounded men helped each other toward the upper decks. At 9:45, Commander Evans gave his final order, abandon ship. Men jumped from the decks into the oil-slicked water. Some were wounded. Some helped shipmates who couldn't swim. The sea was warm, but they were 50 miles from land, and there were sharks. Commander Evans moved through the sinking ship, checking compartments, making sure no one was left behind. His executive officer found him on the main deck. Captain, you need to go over the side. According to survivors, Evans looked at his ship, looked at the water already covering the main deck. He shook his head. I'll go down with the ship, he said. Those were his last recorded words. At 10:10 on the morning of October 25, 1944, the USS Johnston rolled to port and slipped beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. She had been in combat for 3 hours and 9 minutes. As the Johnston sank, something remarkable happened. A Japanese destroyer came alongside the survivors in the water. The men braced for machine gun fire had happened in other battles. Instead, according to multiple American survivors, a Japanese officer appeared on the destroyer's bridge. He looked down at the men in the water, and he saluted. The destroyer moved on, without firing a shot. The battle off Samar was over. The Japanese fleet, which could have destroyed Taffy 3 and then fallen on the invasion transports, had turned away, turned back. Why? Because 7 small ships had convinced them they were facing a much larger force. Because destroyers don't charge battleships unless there are more ships behind them. Because in the confusion and smoke and chaos, the Japanese admiral had lost his nerve. The escort carrier survived. Gambier Bay was lost. The whole, the Samuel B. Roberts, gone. But 5 carriers made it, and with them, the 40,000 men on the invasion beaches, who would have been slaughtered if the Japanese had reached the transports. The Johnston and her sisters had bought time with their lives. Of the 327 men aboard the Johnston, 141 survived. They spent hours in the water, some for 2 days before rescue ships found them. Commander Ernest Evans was not among them. Many of the ship's officers went down with her. The navigator, Lieutenant Ed DeGarry, the chief engineer, Lieutenant Joe Bechtel, who kept the engines running until water reached the boilers. Dozens of gunners and torpedomen who stayed at their stations in the water. The survivors clung together. They sang songs to keep spirits up. They fought off sharks. They watched ships steam past without stopping. The battle was still raging, and rescue ships couldn't risk themselves yet. When rescue finally came, the men were exhausted, burned, wounded. Many had swallowed so much oil-contaminated seawater that they were violently ill. The hospital ship's doctors worked around the clock. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagen, who survived, wrote the action report. In Navy regulations, action reports are supposed to be factual, dry, technical. Hagen's report was different. He couldn't help it. He wrote, "The commanding officer, Commander Ernest E. Evans, was a fighting man from the soles of his broad feet to the ends of his curly red hair. He was an Oklahoman and proud of the Indian blood he had in him. He was a fighter. The Johnston was a fighting ship, but he was very human and had a keen sense of humor. He was always kind and thoughtful of his officers and men. I know he went down with the ship." On May 17, 1945, the Navy announced that Commander Ernest Evans had been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. He was the first Native American in the Navy to receive it. During World War II, the citation read, in part, "Outgunned and outmaneuvered, the Johnston fought with extraordinary heroism to protect the escort carriers. Commander Evans's inspiring leadership, courageous example, and aggressive fighting spirit reflected the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service." The survivors scattered after the war. Many didn't talk about what happened off Samar for decades. It was too raw, too painful. But in the 1980s, they began to have reunions. First a handful of men, then more. They shared stories. Remember the men who hadn't come home. And they talked about Commander Evans. Robert Hagen, who'd been Evans's executive officer, attended every reunion until his death in 2003. In a 1990 interview, he said something that captured what the crew felt. "We were scared. Every man aboard was scared. We knew we were going to die. But the captain, he wasn't scared. Or if he was, he never showed it. He just did what needed to be done. And that made us feel like maybe we could do it too. He didn't order us to be brave. He showed us how." The Navy didn't forget. In 2019, 75 years after the battle off Samar, the Navy announced that a new Arleigh Burke-class destroyer would be named USS Ernest E. Evans DDG-141. She's under construction now. When she's commissioned, she'll carry the name of that Cherokee commander from Oklahoma who taught his crew what courage looks like. In 2019, a research vessel found the wreck of the Johnston. She rests in 21,000 feet of water, deeper than any other shipwreck ever discovered. The pressure at that depth is immense, but she's intact. Her bow still points toward where the Japanese fleet had been, still charging. There's no grave for Commander Evans. His body was never recovered, but at Arlington National Cemetery, there's a memorial plaque every October 25th. On the anniversary of the battle, someone leaves flowers. Usually there's no note, but once there was. It said, "You bought us time. We made it count." The battle off Samar changed naval history. Before that day, conventional wisdom said destroyers should never engage capital ships. After Samar, the doctrine changed, because 7 small ships proved that courage and determination could face down overwhelming force and win, not by destroying the enemy, but by making the enemy believe they couldn't win. 4 ships went down that day. Nearly 1,500 men were killed, but the invasion fleet survived. The Philippines were liberated. And the Japanese Navy never recovered from the shock of being turned back by destroyers. In the years after the war, survivors from all the ships of Taffy 3 formed a lasting bond. They called themselves the Tinkin Sailors, a term for destroyer men. They met every year. They told stories. They remembered. And they talked about October 25th, 1944, the day they looked death in the face and charged. Anyway, there's a question people sometimes ask about the battle off Samar. Why did they do it? Why charge battleships and destroyers? Why not run, make smoke, save themselves? The answer isn't complicated. Behind them were carriers full of pilots and sailors. Behind those carriers were transport ships full of soldiers. Behind those soldiers were families back home who were counting on them to win this war and come back. Commander Evans and his crew knew that if the Japanese fleet got through, thousands would die, maybe tens of thousands. The invasion would fail. The war would go on longer. More mothers would lose sons. More wives would lose husbands. So they stood in the way. They didn't do it because they were heroes. They did it because it was their job, because those were their orders, not the orders they received, but the orders they gave themselves. Protect the ships behind you, buy time, make it count. And they did. Today's Navy still teaches the battle off Samar at the Naval Academy. When young officers study tactics and strategy, they study what happened off that Philippine coast. But the real lesson isn't about tactics. The real lesson is about what people can do when they decide that something matters more than their own survival. The USS Johnston rests now in the deepest waters where a warship has ever been found. 21,000 feet down, for miles beneath the surface, in eternal darkness. Asterisk, but her story isn't dark. It's about men who were scared and did their jobs anyway. About a commander who taught his crew that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right when every instinct says to run. About a ship that refused to quit. When you visit the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, there's an exhibit about Taffy 3. There are photos of the ships, names of the men, a piece of railing from the Johnston recovered by divers. And there's a quote on the wall. It's from Admiral William F. Halsey, who commanded the Third Fleet. After the battle, when he learned what had happened off Samar, he said, "In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 0730 and 0930 off Samar. The men of the Johnston didn't set out to be heroes. They set out to do their duty, to protect the ships behind them, to buy time for men who couldn't defend themselves. They succeeded, and in succeeding, they showed us something about what it means to serve, about what it means to stand your ground when everything says to run, about choosing duty over survival. The Pacific is quiet now where the Johnston fought. The waves roll as they always have. The sun rises and sets. Ships pass overhead, most never knowing what happened for miles beneath them. But we know we remember the destroyer that charged battleships, the crew that followed their captain into impossible odds, the Cherokee commander from Oklahoma who told his men, this is going to be a fighting ship. And they believed him. Fair winds and following seas. Johnston, your watch is over, but we have the watch now.